maybe not start. Yeah. Thanks everyone for coming back. For those that have been able to come back, and apologies again for the confusion with the time. Can you hear me online? Can you hear us? Maybe just give a thumbs up or something. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So yeah, I'm David Blaine, GP and Senior Clinical Lecturer here. Really pleased to welcome Mahon from Research Information Services to talk to us about open research, but other elements of that as well. Yeah. I'll close the door open for now. And then you.
Great, thanks everyone, and thanks for coming back. Brilliant. So my name is Matt. I'm a member of the Research Information Management team. We're based in the library, and we're the team that does support around research data management and open access for publications. Increasingly, we're doing more and more support for open research in general. So that's support for making any part of your research process more open and transparent and reproducible. Today, I'm going to talk about the research data management aspects of our service and what kind of support the university offers for research data management activity. My talk is about 20 minutes, and then we'll have time for you both to ask any questions you might have. I'm not going to talk specifically about open access for publications or other aspects of open research because they kind of need their own time slot, I think, to do them justice. But I'm also really happy to take questions on those topics if you do have any kind of burning questions. So, firstly, just to highlight that the university does have a really wide range of support for open research activity, and when you get a copy of the slides, you'll also get a link to this nice video introduction to open research at the University of Glasgow that we have available. And yeah, just to give you a sense that when we talk about open research, we're talking about really the whole research life cycle and not just what you do with your outputs at the end of the project. And that is similar when we're dealing with research data management. So what are the benefits of good research data management?
You should be able to minimize that with more. I think. A high video panel. I'll have something. Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, so why should you pay attention to how you manage your research data? And why do so many funders and indeed institutions push good research data management? Well, we want to improve the integrity and the reproducibility of your research by having your data deposited somewhere appropriate at the conclusion of your project so that it can be found so that it's to do it. We want to facilitate the sharing and reuse of research data, and the research funders especially consider this to improve the quality of the research environment. And a big aspect of that is making sure that you only apply for funding to collect new data in cases where there isn't pre-existing data already available. So we want to encourage the reuse of data wherever it's possible to do so. There are also lots of benefits to you as individual researchers. People talk often about reducing the risk of data loss, and what people tend to think about is like a PhD student with their laptop and hard drive and leaving it on the bus or in the pub or something, and having kind of catastrophic loss of data or dropping something and it breaks and that's it. But we're also equally interested in reducing a very different kind of data loss, which is a kind of pervasive loss of your memory of what exactly your data is over time. So, you know, it's very easy in the moment to say, oh, I'm not going to document exactly what I did or which version of this is the final version, because I'm sure I'll remember that. But then, you know, we're thinking in the very long term here. So in 5 or 10 years' time, we want you to be able to go back to your data and work out exactly what you did, ideally in a form that someone could reproduce it within. We also want to ensure that you comply with funder and university requirements, and especially if you're early in your career or a PhD student, the more outputs you can have available and the more kind of documented record of your work is publicly visible. We've seen kind of quite a lot of evidence that this improves the possibility of you forming new collaborations, kind of get jobs and so on. And also in the immediate term, it makes it much easier to write up your results if your data is all very well organized and managed. In terms of the funders' support for open research and mandated policies around data, most UK funders tend to come in line with this statement of common principles from UKRI, which is that any publicly funded research data are a public good that's produced in the public interest, and so they should be made openly available with as few restrictions as possible in a timely and responsible manner that doesn't harm intellectual property. So what this means in practice is, unless you have a compelling reason to restrict access to your data, you should plan to make it openly available for other people to reuse, and that includes if you're seeking MRC funding or ESRC funding or Wellcome funding, the funders will have an expectation that you will seek consent from your participants to make your data openly available to reuse, and it's only if you can't achieve that consent that it's acceptable to keep your data closed or restricted. Other reasons for restricting access to your data might be for commercial exploitation of the data, because you have third-party data that you don't have permissions to share, or if there's export controls or some other security reason for restricting access to your data. The University of Glasgow's requirements around data are very similar to those of the major funders, and you won't find a situation where the university's requirements are in contradiction to the funders. The expectation is that data is made openly available where it's possible to do so, and you'll see that the Code of Good Practice actually uses the same wording as the UKRI statement. There's also an expectation that you will document your data to the extent that at least someone in your field could understand what you did in order to produce it. And wherever possible to do so, you should put your data in a repository where someone can at least see a record that that data exists, even if it's not going to be shareable open access. When we talk about research data, and we talk about which, in the context of these policies, we mean any information that, whether digital or physical, that's required to underpin the conclusions of your research. So this might be primary data that you've gathered experimentally or observationally. It might be secondary data that you're reusing that someone else has provided, derived data that you've made from combining any of those elements, visualizations, your research notebooks, depending on what type of work you're doing, and so on and so forth. It's really up to you as the experts in your field to determine what someone might need to see in order to understand how you reached your conclusions. And the best starting point for this is to look at what people in your field are producing as their data. If you read your paper and you look at the data and you think, oh, actually, that doesn't tell the whole story, then the next time you come to write a paper using similar data, make sure that you make the right combination of stuff available. You might also gather a lot of material in the course of your research, which is information that you need in order to complete your project, but which wouldn't come into the scope of data policies. And I'm thinking of things like your participants' consent information, other kind of project management materials. When you're planning how you're going to manage your data, please do take that stuff into account when it comes to like where you're going to store material, how you're going to document it. But just bear in mind that the policies around depositing research data are really about the research data, not about other kind of project management information. So the basics of good data management is firstly to have a data management plan. That's a simple document that explains what's going to happen in your data. Get a good file naming strategy and a good folder structure for arranging your data. I'm sure I'm telling you all things that you know, by the way, but I just think it's best to just say them all out loud. Think about curating the data sets that underpin your publications and making sure that they're in a state that means that someone who reads the publication can also understand exactly how you reach your conclusions. Deposit these data sets in repositories and cite them using appropriate data citations. The data management plan is a short document which sets out how the data arising from a project will be handled for its entire life. So a description of the data, standards and methodologies that you're using to collect it and manage it, any ethical or intellectual property or commercial concerns and restrictions which might affect how the data can be deposited and used and shared, Think about what your plans are for data sharing and access, and a strategy for the long-term preservation of the data, which would normally be to put it in a repository where it can be kept for the timeframe that's mandated by your funder or by the university. We have a tool called DMP Online, which is a web-based tool for writing and managing and editing data management plans, which you can use to see not only data management plan templates, but also funder and institutional requirements from a very wide range of different organizations. So if you're writing a data management plan for a project that you're doing collaboratively with a different university, you might want to see what their guidance and advice is. Equally, if you're writing one for a funder, you'll need to see their template and guidance. We also can review data management plans for you in advance of submitting a funding application or just at any point in the research lifecycle. Data management plans aren't fixed documents in the same way that, for example, your ethics paperwork is. So we expect data management plans to be updated as your practices develop over time. Just to give you a sense of where data management planning fits with some other processes at the university, this is the recommended workflow for initiating a project that involves personal data. And this is something that we put together with the University Ethics Committee and with the data protection team. The recommendation is that once you know what your project is, write a data management plan in which you explain everything that you want to do with your data, obviously taking into account university funder requirements. Then look at the paperwork that's required for GDPR purposes. So any project with personal data will need a data protection impact assessment form. I feel the same way about GDPR. Your data protection impact assessment form needs to be reviewed by the Data Protection Office if your data processing is high risk. So that is if you have special category personal data or very large quantities of non-special category personal data. If your data processing is medium or low risk, they can still review it, but it's not a requirement.
What's GDPR?
Sorry, the General Data Protection Regulation, which is data protection legislation in the UK. And then if you're sharing any personal data outside the university with any organisation or individual, you need a data sharing agreement, which is a contract that basically where they commit to complying with GDPR. The contracts you can draw these up. And then in every case where you're collecting data from participants, they need to have a privacy notice which notifies them of their legal rights when it comes to their personal data. Once that's all in place, that is the point where we recommend that you apply for ethical approval for your research, because then you'll be asking for approval from the ethics committees and consent from the participants for all of the planned uses of the data, including its long-term storage and sharing, which you will have mapped out in your data management plan. There's a version, and when you get the slides, you'll see there's a version of this workflow in our Enlighten repository that has links to all of the relevant organizations and individuals within and outside the university who provide advice and guidance on this. So there's a big framework of support for you to complete these sets of paperwork. And what I would say about all this is the first time you go through it, it is quite onerous, but then once you have a good version, you can modify it for future projects. So it actually becomes quite straightforward. And the best thing to do is to build it into your normal work. If you supervise students as well, I mean, they'll still need to go through the same process for their PhD work if they have personal data. As a supervisor, you might decide to support them by writing templates for the kind of data that you always work with. That's a useful thing that some people have decided to do. So when it comes to documenting your data, this is back to this question of kind of memory loss over time when it comes to remembering exactly what you did. The best thing to do is think about what information you might need to make sense of your data in 5 years, 10 years time. The possibilities for what you include in your documentation are fairly endless, and it really depends on what your research is. But just bear in mind that the more documentation you can produce at the time that you're collecting your data, the easier it is, because it's very hard to kind of retrofit documentation into data as it's collected over time. This is the recommended file and folder structure for research data in a project. this is very much idealized and it's very linear, and we know that the research process doesn't actually work like this in practice. But what we would recommend is that you start with a structure like this, and then if you vary from it, you can do it on purpose. We would encourage you to take a copy of your raw data, put it to one side, and don't touch it for the duration of your project. So you always have a clean copy of the raw data that you can go back to in the event that there's some adulteration to the data elsewhere. This is especially important now that all of the Microsoft Office packages, if you're using those, they all auto-save everything. So it's good to always make new copies that you're working on, so you don't save back into raw data files. And in these kind of top level folders, the raw data and the working copy, put in a README file. This is a file that's just called readme.txt, which is just a simple text file that says, what is in this folder? What is it? How is it acquired? What's needed to open it? What's the file naming convention for stuff here? Any other useful information? And then as you process your data, make new folders for your process versions, put in README files that say what you've done to process them. And eventually you'll develop a chain of provenance that takes you from your raw data all the way through to the final subset of a figure or illustration or something that's going to make it into a publication. And if you work in a way like in a structure along these lines, it'll make it easy for you to think about which parts, which of these folders, which processed versions do you need to deposit in order for someone to see your entire working process. It may be that you only deposit the raw data and the final processed version, and then you have good documentation or an executable workflow that gets you from raw data to processed version. Or it might be that your processing is really idiosyncratic or time-consuming or expensive, and then you need to deposit those intermediate steps. But that's something that you have a lot of latitude to determine yourself based on exactly what research you're conducting. When it comes to storing live data, this is data that you're working on. The university has a range of different locations available to you. The majority of data that you produce is going to go on a university shared drive or on SharePoint storage like Teams or on your personal OneDrive. Our recommendation is that data in collaborative projects should go on Teams, and if you're working just by yourself, then use OneDrive. What we don't recommend is that you use commercial cloud storage platforms because their functionality is very similar to the drives that are provided to you by the university. But any issues with those tend to incur costs, whereas at the university, we can normally, the universities like Microsoft storage is provided for you for research purposes. So if you have a real research need to have more space or to have different functionality, it can normally be arranged on your behalf. Everyone has a terabyte on OneDrive, and each team you set up has a terabyte itself. If you're going to go over that, you need to talk to your local IT about getting it expanded, but I believe they can expand it up to 25 terabytes without incurring a cost.
So we can ask for expansion.
Yeah, and it's and then there's also a petabyte scale storage coming online. I think it's being piloted in the next 6 months or so. So there will be very large scale storage available soon.
Sorry, what are the 4 columns?
So the first one is the shared drive, that's normally called J. The S is SharePoint, which is Microsoft Teams. OneDrive is your personal version of SharePoint storage. And the last one has all of the Dropbox, Google Drive, and iCloud, which we don't recommend that you use. There are also potentially GDPR implications if you're handling personal data. We don't recommend that you put any personal data on third-party cloud storage platforms because you don't have a guarantee that the data will be kept in a territory that is compliant with GDPR. Whereas our university storage is suitable for personal data unless there's some kind of special condition placed on it that means that it has to be kept in a particular location. And if that's the case, come and talk to us and we can advise you much more kind of concretely based on the needs in your data. IT services have lots of guidance as well on exactly what these storages offer. And but if you do have any questions about that, you can just come to us and we can find the right person to give you advice. So then when it comes to writing a paper, or a thesis or anything where you want to have the data associated with publication, we would recommend that you bring together the relevant documentation for what you've done, the data itself, which underpins the research that you're publishing, and a README file, which at least lists what the files are, file types, folders, and naming conventions, so that someone can look at your collection of stuff and get a sense of what it contains. Once this package is ready, put it in a suitable repository and cite it using a digital object identifier, a DOI. We have a lot of advice and guidance available on our web pages about data availability statements. Data availability statements are a UKRI requirement. So if you're funded by UKRI, you will need to have a statement in your paper that says where your data is and where it can be found. And in the latest version of the Code of Good Practice, we've expanded this to a requirement for all University of Glasgow researchers. That you should make sure you cite your data properly. When it comes to choosing a repository, we have Enlighten Research Data, which is our institutional repository that we manage. We can take data that is that needs to be kept confidential, i.e. completely invisible, data where there'll be a public record but people won't be able to access it, data where people need to access the data only on request, or open access data. So really we can fit a very wide range of requirements. There are lots of public repositories that are just available for you to use. So Figshare and Zenodo are two examples of free public repositories, and we free up to a certain file size. And then Re3Data, re3data.org is a registry of research repositories, which is a resource that can help you to find subject repositories in your area. You might use it to find repositories where you want to put your data, but you may also use it to just find data that's available in the field. And our recommendation really would be to put your data in the most appropriate repository, i.e. the one that people in your field actually use and look at. Our repository, Enlighten Research Data, is what we call a repository of last resort, which means it's available to you, but we would prefer it if you put your data in the most appropriate place. There's no mandate that you deposit data with us. If you put your data somewhere else, then let us know and we can make a record in our repository that just points to your data held elsewhere, and then it will appear in your staff profile and so on. What we don't want to do is have multiple copies of the same data set deposited in different locations, because we want all the citations to go to the one kind of canonical version, wherever that might be. Lots of repositories have conditions on what types of data they'll accept. Some repositories only accept open data, some need particular file formats and documentation, some have certain file size limits. Lots of repositories also charge over a certain quantity of data. So Enlighten Research Data charges, our fees kick in if you're depositing more than 5 gigabytes of data. They start very low. If you have between 5 gigabytes and 250 gigabytes, we charge about £200 to store that archivally for 10 years. So just make sure when you're looking to choose a place to put your data that you're not settled on somewhere that's going to incur a cost. But also if you're planning a project and you're writing the budget, a lot of these costs can be included. So we can advise on that as well, kind of case by case. The process for depositing your data in Enlighten Research Data is really straightforward. What we want you to do is prepare your data by separating it into access conditions. So put all your open access data in one folder, all the data that needs to be deposited but it's going to be restricted in another folder. Keep all your relevant documentation and README file with it. If you did have participants who consented, give us blank copies of the participant information and consent form, and then email us at research-data management and we'll do a mediated deposit on your behalf, so you don't have to go and enter it all into the repository yourself. You can send us files using file transfer as well as in this way. This is an example of a dataset in the Enlighten repository. So we link through to funding information, we link through to related Enlighten publications. If there are files available, so this is an open access data set, they'll just appear in the sidebar where someone can click and download them. if the data set was particularly large, so too large to download over a web browser, there'd be a request data button, and we would just pass it on to the user. If it were restricted and someone needed to make a request to access it, then they'd see a request data button. If it was completely closed, there would just be a note that said the data aren't available, but we are storing them for research integrity purposes. So that's the kind of range of options that are available. We also push data from these repositories, from the publications repository and the data repository, into research reporting tools. So if you need to complete a research fish return for your funder, we can push data sets and publications into there if they're deposited with us. These systems also feed into promotion and PDR. Just to give you a sense of what data looks like in a different repository, this is the UK Data Services repository. They have very similar information. The main thing that's different is that they have a different DOI string for their data. So all publications should include a data access statement. This is a simple statement that says, where are the data held? How can they be accessed? Under what conditions? We have a document with loads of examples of data access statements for different cases in our among our guidance. So you can go and have a look and modify any of those statements as you want to make them fit in your case. This is an example of a data availability statement in a paper. Some journals, increasingly journals, will have places where people can include data availability statements. So under a header that would go kind of alongside where the funding and acknowledgements are. If your publication doesn't have a space for a data availability statement, then you can include it in a footnote or in the acknowledgements. Those are kind of the best places to put them for now. But the main thing is to have it in there somewhere, because we don't want people to find a publication and just assume that you haven't deposited the data. So the kind of advice and support that we can offer, in advance of submitting a funding application, we can review your data management plans, or we can advise you on costing RDM activities into awards. We're very happy to review data management plans at any point in the research process, like I said. We have the repository where we can store your research data, and if we're not storing it, we can also use the repository to document it so that it appears in your staff profile. And we can also offer advice and training on any aspects of research data management at any point in the research lifecycle. We also have training courses available. So there's the Introduction to Research Data Management Moodle course, which is compulsory for PGRs in MBLS, and it's recommended for everyone. And we do specific training on using the DMP online tool to write the data management plan, and that runs monthly, and you can book it through Core HR. We're also very happy to offer bespoke training on any aspects of RDM. So if, for example, if there's a funding call and there's a lot of people who are writing similar applications, we can come and do a session on writing data management plans for that funder. Or if there's a cohort of students who are all working on a similar project or with a similar type of data, we can also come and offer support around that. So that was the content of my presentation. Now, there are a couple of questions that came in on the Padlet. Honestly, I can't remember if these are ones that someone in the room has added or someone on my added, or if they're ones that we put in to kind of like prime a discussion. But I think before I'll deal with these, I just wonder if anyone in the room or in Zoom has a question that's come up.
Yeah, thanks. That was a great talk. I wondered, so if somebody is using Enlighten research data, what happens at the end of the 10 years? Do you kind of get a warning, ahead of time to say your project is about to come to the end, and kind of what steps you need to take at that point?
Yeah, so we set the retention date based on the submission date. So when the data comes into us, we'll just set a review date, which will be 10 years from when we received it. And at that point, it's interesting, the funder mandated deposit came in 2012. So the first deposited data sets were in 2013, and we're just at the point now where we're starting to get data sets up for review. And what we're doing at the moment is, the first thing we're doing is we're checking whether they've been accessed or downloaded. For some funders, the 10-year period resets from the date of last access. So that is effectively endless. And in those cases, we're saying, great, we'll just keep it. If a data set's been kept and accessed and there's no ethical approval, or it didn't need ethical approval, we'll probably just extend the period for another 10 years. In cases where the research has received ethical approval, we need to check what was promised, and because in some cases the paperwork will say we will keep this for 10 years only and then destroy it. If it's not obvious to us what we should do, we'll go back to the researchers and ask them what they would like to happen to it. If we determine that the data should be destroyed or should be removed from the repository, we'll still go back to the researchers and ask them. What we're not going to do is just press delete without checking with anyone. I think the other thing to say is that even if we've charged for a deposit the first time around, the kind of diminishing cost of storage means that it's very unlikely that we would be charging. We wouldn't come back to someone and say, you paid us 200 quid in 2013 to deposit this. Can you give us another 200 quid, or we'll chuck it out, So yeah, the short answer is we'll come back to you and ask.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Put their hand up online.
Alexander.
Hello. Yeah, I was just wondering, in terms of data repositories, I'm not sure whether you mentioned OSF or things like ResearchBox. I'm just wondering what the university feels about using those for data as well as for other materials.
I'm not familiar with ResearchBox. OSF is fine, I think. The main thing to check is, does it give you a digital object identifier for your data? What we wouldn't recommend doing is using something that's very obviously a publications platform, like an articles platform, and trying to kind of shove a data set into it. We've seen some cases where people try and put data on places like academia.edu that's just actually not even really appropriate for publications, I think. But yeah, and if you're looking at a repository or a place where you think you're putting your data and you're not sure whether it's an appropriate place or not, you can always just check with us, and we can advise case by case. But yeah, OSF is definitely fine.
Great. And just on OSF, is there a policy or guidance on what license to use for registrations within OSF? So, you can do Creative Commons or copyleft or none. And I'm just wondering if obviously some of that will depend upon the data, but is there a particular guidance that we should also be looking at? Yeah,
so the university's recommended open access license with a Creative Commons Attribution license, which is a CC BY is the initial for it. And that's a license that enables people to reuse the work as they see fit, provided they credit the original authors. So basically by citing the work. We wouldn't recommend any licenses with any open access licenses with any more restrictive terms in them. So that's the non-commercial licenses or the no derivatives licenses, or the other kind of Creative Commons restrictions that are available. And the reason we don't recommend those is because some funders forbid them, and it's much easier messaging for us to just say, we also recommend that you use a less restrictive open access license. If you feel that your work should be made open access with no restriction, not even the restriction that someone should acknowledge your work, then I think that's probably fine. So CC0 or a public domain license might be appropriate in some cases. But really what we would be looking at, I think, is what the data consists of. Is it derived from a third-party data set that already has a license condition on it that would prevent you from applying a different license? So sometimes if you use open access data, you have an obligation to continue with the same license for any derivatives that you produce. And then when it comes to looking at kind of what else is going on with the data, things to take into account are, have you discussed it with the IP and commercialization team? do you think that is there a commercial use of the data that you'd like to secure before you make it open access? Are there parts of the data which can't be shared open access at all? Is there third-party material? And then increasingly something that we're having to think about is export control. So the government has fairly new legislation, which means that research on certain topics can't be shared with certain countries that the UK government thinks form a security risk if you give them access to data that has, for example, military use or even if it's dual use. So that's something else that we have to start taking into consideration. If you're not sure what license to apply, again, you can come and speak to us and we can help find the right person in the university to advise on it. It may not always be us.
Thank you.
Hey, come in.
Hi, thanks. That was really interesting. It's always useful to get a refresher on these kinds of things. It was actually more of a comment and a degree of warning. Having been going through the process at the moment, any research that involves health data, even before we start thinking about, for example, adding in information around gender, for example, is reviewed or is considered as high risk. So if you're then, it means that it has to go through and be considered by the data protection impact assessment team at Glasgow. However, they are currently understaffed, and so there's long delays in getting those through. So it's just a warning to think about that. And certainly, if you're following the advice that you've given today, Matt, about doing all of that first before you do your ethics application, that really is going to extend things out and could be problematic if, for example, master's students were required to go through that kind of process. So it's as I say, it's not really a question, it's more of a sort of comment and a warning at the moment about the situation we're facing with DPIA assessments.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. And so we ran a campaign around this over the summer that was aimed at supervisors. It was called Get Your Ducks in a Row. And it was about encouraging supervisors wherever possible to prepare example paperwork for their students, because what we don't want to do is teach students that because these processes are time consuming, they can kind of bypass them, if you know what I mean. Yeah, the delays to the review for the data protection team is an issue, and it's one that the team themselves aren't responsible for because they are short-staffed and they're not being given more resource. So what I would say is, as soon as you start thinking about a project, you don't need to wait until you've been funded, for example. You can just start completing that paperwork as soon as possible. As soon as you know what you're going to be doing, you can start. And it's fine to run those processes in parallel. And there's someone outside who I think wants to come in. Yeah. Five minutes?
Yeah, I think 5 minutes.
Great. So should I just quickly go through these questions that came in on the pad, maybe came in on the pad. So just to make it clear that there's no requirement that all of the data you deposit in a repository is open access. The first reason for depositing data is to preserve a copy of all of the data that underpins your research. And so you should plan to deposit all of your data, even if none of it can be shared. The best approach, I think, is to identify all of the data that underpins your research, plan to deposit that, and then identify the parts of that data which can be shared. So it's a kind of two-stage process there. Yes.
Thank you for the presentation, very useful. My question is about the plan, the data management plan. Like, should we do it if we are? Should we only do it if we are just dealing with primary data, or if we are working on secondary data? So we have already data sets that we will be working on. Should we write a data management plan?
Yes, you should. Because you still have, because all the rest of it, apart from what new data are you collecting section, will still apply in your case. And especially if you're reusing data that has conditions of reuse already set, it's really important to establish which parts of your final data set that you produce are going to be derived from that and which come from elsewhere. And then because you'll have like a mixing of licenses effectively that you'll need to plan for, so that at the end you can have some certainty that what you've produced can be deposited somewhere. Or if it can't, you'll still need to produce enough documentation that someone could try and replicate what you did by going to the original source of your data.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I suppose it's covered that. Yeah, so if you are working with human participants, just make sure you seek consent for all of the planned uses of your data. Seek consent for data sharing, and then if people don't want to consent to that, or if you don't get ethical approval for it, or if you decide that asking for that consent means that people won't participate, then consider depositing but making it a closed or controlled deposit, and consider what parts of your documentation can be made available to use. There are no accepted anonymization strategies. There's no generic anonymization strategy to make your data open. We prefer to think about data minimization and de-identification rather than anonymization, because calling it anonymization gives the impression that it's like an on-off switch, when actually we're also really interested in preventing triangulation between different identifiers other than people's names in your data set. There's lots of advice and guidance from the UK Data Service on this, which you might find useful. If you can't share your data, or if you don't have any data in your data set, you should still include a data statement in your paper, because the data statement can say there is no data available from this paper, it's just a review paper, or it's only an analysis of existing data, you can find that here. Or it might say there is a data set for this paper, it's deposited, but you don't have permission to access it. These are all completely valid things to include in a data statement. What we want is for you to always include that statement that just explains to a reader what's going on, and if there isn't any data, it's especially important for them to understand why. If you're working with code, there are some code repositories which can produce digital object identifiers to allow you to cite your code. The best one that we found is to put your code in GitHub and use Zenodo, which is a public repository, to produce a code DOI. You can then keep developing the code and fork it and so on, but there'll be a kind of snapshot of it which coincides with your article that is a kind of citable object. And also there's a lot of advice support available out there for producing reproducible kind of code and data packages together if you're doing that kind of work. I think Project Tier is a really good example, and then the SciTeach R group is a group working with R that are based in the University of Glasgow Psychology. They're really super helpful and engaged in that kind of work. So if that's what you're doing, then I really recommend their resources. Also, since they're here, actually they're just there. It's really easy to kind of pull them in and get involved in stuff as well, which I think is great. But most importantly, the message from us is just contact us if you have any questions about any aspect of this or other open research questions. We can provide as much advice and assistance as possible. So that's me. I think we probably need to get out of this room soon, don't we?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Really appreciate it. Thank you. And you were happy for us to share the slides, I think. So
Yeah,
yeah, probably. Super. Thank you, everyone. Apologies again for the confusion with the time. But, yeah, good session. Cheers.